This is just the nature of our lives. We want change. And actually, one of the challenges is we break it into these subcategories and we start to pull things apart as if they're unconnected. But actually, if we look at ourselves and we really want to experience a different life, it's much more holistic than that. I had at first thought, well, spiritual, maybe that's one of the categories. But when I look at people's lives, I think everything is spiritual. Spiritual is actually the piece that integrates everything else. It gives us our direction in life. Some of you want to change a habit or start a habit. Some of you want to have a new identity. Some of you want a new direction in life. It's much more broad than any single category. And so today we're going to talk about the nature of change. It's the perfect thing to talk about here because here at Suncrest, we have a mission, and a lot of people know our mission. If you're pretty new here, I'm going to bring you up to speed on it. Our mission at Suncrest is to be used by God to change lives. Used by God to change lives. Now, you should kind of memorize that and think that's who we're trying to be as a church. But just when you think about that mission, one of the things about it is that it's not fully realized until you go through the process of personal change and then let God use you in a way that brings change to other people. Being used by God to change lives. But we're gonna just shorten our aim a little bit today and say we're not going to quite yet talk about the transformation that God would want us to do to bring to other people. Let's just talk about the transformation in ourselves. And I want you to think about this. If this is our mission as a church, to be used by God to change lives, then one of the things we know is that if there aren't lives changing around here, we're failing. We're failing as a church. If no one's experiencing growth or new things in their life, and you could probably think in your own life right now, just in the time since you've been at Suncrest, which might be a matter of weeks or months, or it might be 20 years. Since you've been at Suncrest, have you experienced this transformation with God in your life? Is it ongoing in some sense? Now, there's no doubt, I talk to people all the time, and the answer would be a resounding yes. They say, Greg, my marriage was in a dark and dismal place with very little hope when we walked through the doors. And today, we're relating to one another. We're trusting God with our lives. I talk to people all the time who would say, you know what, Greg, I've grown in the way that I'm out there serving God. That's different than it ever was before. I've grown in my generosity. I've grown in making sure I'm integrated in relationships with people who are followers of Jesus. Greg, I'm reading the scriptures every day, and I'm really listening for what God's saying to me, where he's getting my attention. There's people who experience transformation like that. And then there's other people, this might be you, who'd say, you know what, honestly, I think back over my time at Suncrest, and I think the answer is no. I don't think I've experienced change in my life. And whenever, we can be honest about that, we can say, well, it's one of three people's issue. It's always either God or you or us, and it's not God, so it's down to two. It might be us, it's possible, but it also might be you. It might be that though there's opportunities to start letting God use you in serving different places or connecting in relationships with other believers and growing in your faith or being baptized or reading the scriptures every day, it might be that though there's those opportunities, you're just not taking them. And that's a challenge, right? Because to experience transformation, we all go through a process. Now, what we're going to see in the story today is that there's actually different intensity levels to this process, and I think you'll resonate with this as soon as I describe them. When we think about the mission of that original group of followers, you could have said their mission was to be used by God to change lives, to represent Christ to Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. But there's different words that we talk about when we use this, when we explore this idea of change. So one word is transformation. And transformation just means change, right? You experience something new, and this might even be in a segment of your life like we were talking about before. But a step beyond transformation is what we'd call conversion. Someone who actually had a life going in one direction, and they turned it around and they went the other way. It's a new way of life, a new way of thinking. Something's different, something's better in life because they've experienced conversion. But perhaps even a fair way to describe the step beyond that is with the word resurrection. To say someone's actually died to their old life. And they've been raised to walk a new life. You've been resurrected just as Christ was resurrected, and you didn't physically die, but that doesn't mean you didn't die. That old life is gone, and there's an entirely new life, not just a better life, but a new life that's taken off. And it's powerful if you start to experience the different degrees of this transformation that can take place in our lives. Well, the story that we're going to look at today is from Acts chapter 9, and it's the story of a conversion and a resurrection experience. It is the story of Saul, who would eventually change the name to Paul with this new identity that he has. And while the principles that I'm going to talk to you about are true, probably for any kind of transformation, that it's always a process of before and during and after, I really do want to ask you today to think about this in light of your experience, your conversion, your resurrection as it relates to following Jesus. So I'm going to describe these three categories that Saul went through. And when we're finished, not immediately, when we're finished, I'm going to ask you to mark the box or just think in your mind about which place you're in right now. So let's start with before. Before someone becomes a follower of Jesus. For some people in the room, this is where you are right now. You're exploring. You're not a follower of Jesus yet. I'm glad that you're here. I totally respect the journey that you're on. My prayer, of course, is that you will step into this, be baptized, define your faith as a follower of Jesus. Some of you aren't there right now. For some of you, this was only weeks ago or a couple of years ago. You weren't a follower of Jesus, but through your experience, maybe your experience here, you've become a follower of Jesus. And for others of us, it's been decades. I like to think back to the time before I was a follower of Jesus. The memory has to work a little bit. So this is the nature of before. Here's the beginning of Acts chapter 9 as it's describing who Saul was before. Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. Now, if you've been with us, you know that 2 chapters ago, Stephen became the first martyr of the church, the first one to actually die for his faith. And there was a comment by Luke, who's writing this, his sequel to his gospel, and he says, and Saul oversaw the death of Stephen. That's who Saul was. He was a religious leader. He was a Jewish man. He was very upset that people were claiming that Jesus was the Messiah, and it was his personal calling on his life, he felt like, to eradicate this group of Jesus followers. And so he would kill them. Now, here's what happens in this beginning part of this. Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out these murderous threats. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. So he's getting permission to make the trip from Jerusalem to Damascus, and while he's making that trip, he says, if I find anyone who's part of the way, now this don't miss this, they're not even called Christians yet. That doesn't happen until we get to Antioch. At this stage, they're followers of Jesus. They are the way. They're defined by how they lived, by their way of life. There was no such thing as someone who called themselves a Christian but didn't follow Jesus. The whole idea was there was this group of people who were actually following Jesus, and they were trying to come up with a name for them. They called them the Way. So they wanted to take him to Jerusalem. Now, I'm going to show you something I did just this afternoon, right? You all use Google Maps on your phone? I use Google Maps on my phone. Listen, the Bible was written 2,000 years ago, but these are the same cities they are today. You can go to your phone and you can chart out a walk from Jerusalem to Damascus. It actually works. It takes 2 days and 12 hours, 2 full days, 24-hour days, which means 60 hours to walk it. That's 60 hours to walk it now that they have roads. It's a little longer back then. And by the way, there's a little backup on traffic in Tel Aviv over on the left. Don't worry about that at all. But this is the 160-mile walk that Saul was going to take, and he was going to look for people who were followers of Jesus on the way to tear them apart, to imprison them, to stop the movement. That's who he was. Now, what are the qualities of that? Let me just briefly say this. Here's the qualities. The first one is that if you're before your resurrection, you're open to rebellion. Right? Now, it doesn't mean you're rebellious in every area of your life. There's a lot of very good people who aren't followers of Jesus. It doesn't mean that you're crazy rebellious. But it does mean that when you rub up against something that isn't godly, you just go ahead and blow through it. That's what people do before their conversion. And, we could use examples of maybe the deadly sins. There's 7 of them. Let me name a few. Anger. Right? There's some people who have anger issues. And before you're a follower of Jesus, you have anger issues. You're like, who cares? I deserve my anger. You just blow through it. Lust. A lot of people have lust issues. They sleep with who they want to sleep with, when they want to sleep with them. They use porn. They do all those kind of things. And before you're a follower of Jesus, you're like, why not? Like, if that's what you want to do, you just blow through it. You're open to that kind of rebellion. Greedy people, there's greedy people all around. People who decide they're going to use all their money on themselves and their own family. That's the definition of greed. And when you're a greedy person before a conversion experience, you're like, of course, what? It would be silly to live any other way. You just do what you want to do. You're open to rebellion. That's the nature of being before your transformation. And while you're open to rebellion, you're actually closed to change. You're not actually open necessarily to the idea that you're going to change. And this was true for Paul. Now, Paul had an intensity to his personality that was true before he became a follower of Jesus and then after he became a follower of Jesus. His personality didn't necessarily change, but the application of that changed. And one of the things about Saul was you couldn't have told him he was wrong. I mean, without an actual encounter or experience with God, without something to jolt you out of where you are, you'll probably just stay on the same path. You're prone to stay on that path because what's the nature of Paul? Well, Paul had family roots who were Jewish. He had built friendships that were Jewish. He had built a reputation on being a successful Pharisee. It was going to cost him a lot to change. And that would mean that if it's going to cost him, he's much less prone to change. And I don't know if this is ever true of you. It is true of me. We can get pretty convinced we're right about whatever we think. And even the idea that we might be wrong isn't really something we entertain. That's kind of the nature of the before experience. So let me shift then to the during. Some of you might be in the during place right now, where you're going through this spiritual change. Let me just read to you the experience that Saul had on the road to Damascus. As he neared Damascus on his journey, so he was almost there, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him, and he fell to the ground, and he heard a voice say to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And then he says, "Who are you, Lord?" Saul asked. Isn't that an interesting question? I'm kind of asking who you are, but I'm kind of naming who you are, all in the same experience. Now, this is a dramatic account of conversion. My experience of conversion and resurrection was not this dramatic. That's not to say it wasn't dramatic at all. It was not this dramatic. But for Saul, he's kind of coming to grips with the idea that I'm having an experience here where I understand maybe my way isn't the best way. Maybe I'm not Lord. Maybe something else is Lord. Maybe I need to respond to this encounter that I'm having right now. It goes on. "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting," he replied. "Now get up and go into the city, and you'll be told what you must do." The men traveling with Saul stood there, speechless. They heard the sound, but did not see anyone. Can you imagine being one of the guys who's traveling with Saul? Like, what just happened here? Saul got up from the ground, but when he opened his eyes, he could see nothing. And so they led him by the hand into Damascus. What happens in the during stage of transformation or conversion or resurrection? Well, I think there's a few things we learn here. One is that there's an encounter with Jesus. Now, I'm going to fill in the blank with you in a very specific way here in just a moment, but let's just stop with this for a moment. People usually don't decide they're going to follow Jesus based only on an intellectual assent. Knowledge about Jesus is a necessary foundation, but it's actually not the transforming experience. Instead, it's an encounter with Jesus. And this is one of the things that gives me goosebumps around here. When I get the chance to talk to all of you, and you tell me about the time when you were encountering Jesus. Not just knowing about him. It wasn't in a class. But you encountered him. A few months ago, I had breakfast with a guy in our church. He's a real successful business guy, strong, like just a guy you'd respect automatically from the outside. And he lives it out. He's a great dad. And he told me a few months ago, at the end of a message, we sang a song, and a lot of you know this song. It's one of the songs we say, "You're the breath in my lungs. You're the breath in my lungs." And he told me, he's like, "Greg, it was like when we were singing it, that I could feel something inside my lungs. I was having this encounter with God. He said, I don't cry, but I'm standing there crying. And I think that's a beautiful encounter with Jesus. Social media is terrible for lots of reasons, but it's great for lots of reasons too. I'll stream through social media. I saw this a few months ago. Someone from our church, they took a picture of one of our chairs, a row of chairs, and they said, in that chair, it's where my life changed. They had an encounter with Jesus. For some people, it's when they're in the baptistry, and there's this encounter with Jesus. For me, it actually wasn't in a church service. I was laying outside on my back under the stars, and I had this encounter that I can't quite describe to you, but it changed something inside of me. God encountered me through Jesus Christ in that moment. For other people, it's an answered prayer. For some people, it is the words jumping off the page of the Scriptures. But this experience of conversion always includes an encounter with Jesus himself. And this is the important part. It's an encounter with Jesus resurrected. This is so important. Why is it that all these original followers of Jesus were really braver than hell and tougher than nails and changed the world? Why is it that they could live out the commandment of Jesus, do not be afraid? When Jesus was with them, they were afraid all the time. The answer is because when you encounter Jesus, you realize Jesus is alive. He's alive today, and if he's alive today, it means he really rose from the dead, which means he has the power of life and death, which means he has the power over my life and death, which makes me not afraid of anything in this world anymore. I mean, I can't say that I don't back down from that, and I get afraid sometimes. I do, but we know this. It's an encounter with the resurrected Jesus, and the same power that raised him from the dead, God exerts into our lives. When we experience the during experience of transformation, just as Saul did, maybe not with blindness, maybe not with light, but with Jesus, it changes us. It changes us. After this encounter, something else happens, and surely this happened to you when you encountered Jesus. You became completely humbled. And Saul had to be completely humbled. I mean, he was blind, he couldn't see, he had to have help going into the city. But this is so interesting to me because what happens in the during part of choosing to follow Jesus is you have to acknowledge you're going to go down through a dip, you're going to be humbled, there's going to be a certain rock bottom experience if you could think of it in that way, and then you're going to be called out to something else. But this is a very important moment. I have seen hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people almost have a conversion experience. Because they encountered Jesus, but they resisted the humbling. See, what happens when you're humbled is it's kind of a forced choice between going your way, as you've been going, and going his way. And a lot of people love to try to skim across the top of that and say, well, I'll go his way, but I'd kind of like to keep most of mine too. And that's an almost conversion experience. But to end up on your knees, because God is who he says he is, and he wants to give a great gift to you, and he wants to put a calling on your life, that is a humbling experience. I have a friend who struggled with drinking, and he's talked to me about the times when he's had to kind of be honest about that. And he said he heard once, he said, people don't just quit drinking, they don't. Usually, they quit drinking eventually because of either their lover, their liver, or their lawyer. Usually a humbling experience with one of those. It says, the way I'm going on my own, doing life my way, I'm going to have to choose to do it this way or that way. And this is the beauty. We're actually given a different way to live. Here's what happens in the story. It says, this man, Saul, is my chosen instrument to proclaim my name to the Gentiles and their kings and to the people of Israel. He says, listen, there's 12 apostles. You replaced Judas with Matthias. They're doing great in Jerusalem. I kind of had to kick them out. Remember last week we had to kick them out of Jerusalem to get them scattered into Judea and Samaria. God says, I have a calling on this man's life. And it's his role in this world to not let anything stop the spread of the gospel. And he takes it to the Gentiles, he takes it to the Israelites, he takes it to their kings. That becomes true. That's the rest of the story of Acts after we pass a couple more chapters. So that's a dramatic calling, just like it was a dramatic conversion. But for all of us, if we're in this during stage, you're given a calling on your life. And I don't know what your particular calling is. I'm actually not even sure that it's all that important for most people to discern their particular or specific calling, because in general, I know what the calling is. You should be used by God to change lives. God wants your availability in this world to go serve, to go lead, to go make a difference, to walk across the street to your neighbor in need, and to go visit your coworker's dad or son or brother in the hospital to show you care. This is the calling on all of our lives. It's the dip. You have to be humbled, and then you have to come out of it with the calling. That's, I think, one of the beautiful images of death, burial, and resurrection. It's baptism under the water and up out of the water. That's what's going on here. You have a calling to be used by God to change lives. There's an interesting description in the passage at this stage. And this is what you find. Read the book of Acts. You'll find it consistently everywhere. There's a hinge that comes between the during and the after of conversion. This is how it's described. Jesus, this is a guy named Ananias, not the same Ananias who dropped dead earlier in the book of Acts. Jesus has sent me to you, sent me so that you may see again and be filled with the Holy Spirit. This is what comes out of the during experience. You now have God himself living inside of you to be filled with the Holy Spirit. Immediately, something like scales fell from Saul's eyes and he could see again, and he got up and he was baptized. That's what happens in this hinge point between during and after. So let me describe to you after. What does life look like after conversion? Well, it starts pretty simply, actually. Here's what the scriptures say. Saul spent several days with the disciples in Damascus. He stayed there. He decided that the right move was not to immediately go out on his own and take on the world. Instead, he invested himself. And one of the things that the book of Acts doesn't say, but we learn from other parts in the scriptures, is that he went away to Arabia for 3 years to spend time with God and time with others. I call this apprenticeship. Apprenticeship is part of what happens after you become a follower of Jesus. You decide, I can't do this on my own. I need to find someone who will lead me. Many times in an academic culture that a lot of us live in, we think the answer is take a class, learn more, and knowledge is helpful. But having someone in your life who will walk with you, who will lead you, who will be that person, you gotta invest in that. You gotta find that person and experience this kind of apprenticeship, this discipleship from someone else. Listen, I know sometimes it probably sounds like when I say, hey, you should get in a group at Suncrest, that I'm pushing a church program. I can just promise you I'm not. I promise you I'm not. I promise you that what I'm hoping for is that people who have gone through a conversion experience will then integrate themselves with other believers and find a spiritual leader in their life who they can go to help guide them. That doesn't have to be dramatic. You just need someone in your corner. And that's how we structure the experience here. After that apprenticeship experience, Paul goes out and he just tells his new life story. That's what he does. And you might think, oh, do I need to go out and tell people about Jesus after I experience this conversion? Well, I mean, I guess the answer to that's yes, but maybe not in the way you're thinking about it. You see, after Paul had gone through the dip of being humbled and he now had a new calling, his life had changed. My guess, and we'll see this in a minute, is that Paul didn't so much have to go announce to people that his life had changed. He had to explain to people because they saw a different Saul than they saw before. And he had an answer to that question. And that answer is, it was Jesus Christ and his resurrection. If you don't find yourself doing that, you might want to question whether you're really in the after mode or not. See, this is how it kind of went down for Paul, and this will lead to the next one. At once he began to preach in the synagogues that Jesus is the Son of God. All those who heard him were astonished. Now, get your mind around this with me just for a minute. That's the understatement of the century. What had Saul been doing before this? What is the before version of Saul? The before version of Saul was the one who would get people who were part of the way, take them out in the streets, oversee their killing, put them into prison. That's who he was. And now he walks into the synagogue and proclaims that Jesus is the Son of God. They weren't just astonished. They were a little doubtful. You would be too. If he killed your uncle. That's who he is. He's the guy who had killed their uncle, killed their brother, overseen their beatings, the floggings of their family members. And now he strolls into the synagogue to proclaim who this Jesus is. What was he doing? He was living out his calling. God had given him a calling. Saul, you're my chosen one to take this message to the Israelites, to the Gentiles, to their kings, everyone. And when people finally watched him long enough to realize this transformation, this conversion, this resurrection was real, the world changed. Here's what I want to close with this verse, and then I have a very particular question for you. It says, then the church throughout Judea, Galilee, and Samaria enjoyed a time of peace and was strengthened. They had faced resistance after resistance after resistance, much of it because of a man named Saul. And now God had encountered Saul, he had experienced transformation, and now they experience a time of peace. You'll notice where the church has gone. So Judea and Samaria, Galilee too, living in the fear of the Lord. This is how after people live. Before people live afraid of things. After people live in the fear of the Lord. The church increased by numbers, in its numbers. So here's my question. If you think of yourself as a follower of Jesus, which one of these categories describes you? You could mark the box. Before, during, after. And if you're a follower of Jesus, you're going to be prone to mark the box after. Right? You've gone through the conversion and you're here. But this can become a dilemma for us. If you think of yourself as a follower of Jesus, but your life looks nothing like the after. If you're not living out a calling, if you're not apprenticing yourself under the leadership of others, if you're not telling the story of who God is, and you think of yourself as after, I'm going to suggest that you go back to during. Because it's possible that you're one of those people who tried to skim it just across the top. Skip out on the humbling part. Skip out on the rock bottom part. Skip out on the I need to go God's way instead of my way, not my way with a little of God thrown in. And have an encounter with Jesus that changes you. You could have it tonight. And if you're not a follower of Jesus, if you're someone who's in the before category, then all I can ask of you tonight is that you'd open your heart to the idea that you might possibly be wrong. You might be building your life on something and you're kind of closed off to what could be. We're going to sing a couple of songs after the message today. And my prayer is that any of us would open ourselves to an encounter with Jesus. Will you pray with me?